All right, I think we are just about ready to begin. We've given people a few minutes to join us after 12:30, so let's make a start. My name is Lorraine Van Kerkhoff, and I am the Director of the Institute for Water Futures at the ANU, and it's my great pleasure to be hosting this of our first Water on the Horizon series of events today. Let me start, of course, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting or Zooming from, and that may well be quite diverse given the large numbers that we're having join us, which is very exciting. For myself, this is Ngunnawal and Ngambri country, and I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. I know that sometimes these words can sound or feel a bit tokenistic, but I think in this instance, we really have an opportunity to really be walking the talk, and that's extremely exciting for us. We are here in our first, as I mentioned, first event of the year of 2022 in our Water on the Horizon series, and we are placing First Nations first by welcoming Dr. Virginia Marshall to be our first speaker in this important series. And I'm really pleased to welcome Virginia and our host Mark Howden, and of course everybody who's able to join us. It's really fantastic to see such a terrific turnout. Just briefly, to give you some background on our speakers, I will start with Mark. Many of you know Mark Howden. Professor Mark Howden is the Director of the Institute for Climate, Energy and Disaster Solutions at the ANU. You may also know that he's very heavily involved in the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change and is the chair of the ACT Climate Council, has many responsibilities in this domain and tremendous expertise and experience that he brings to us today. Mark is very well established in the academic realm with many publications and lots of experience and research expertise in areas around climate variability, and also, of course, participant in the Conference of Parties COP26, which we will be speaking about today. So thank you to Mark for taking on the role of being our MC and host. But to the main event, I'm really very pleased to welcome back Dr. Virginia Marshall. Again, I'm sure many of you are familiar with Virginia's work. Virginia is the inaugural Indigenous postdoctoral fellowship holder here at the Australian National University, and holds that position within the School of Regulation and Global Governance here at the ANU, as well as with the Fenner School of Environment and Society. Virginia has won many awards for her work, including publication of the seminal book Overturning Aquanullius, which has, I think, really set the scene for within Australia understanding water sovereignty, water rights, and the values, the many values that water holds for Indigenous communities, for Indigenous people throughout the country, and being able to put that into the broader domain of how we make decisions about water is absolutely central to what we're interested in today and wanting to follow through very much so. Virginia is also the lead chief investigator on a new ARC Indigenous Discovery Award, which is very exciting, and we're really looking forward to seeing how that unfolds, and is the first person from the ANU College of Asia and Pacific awarded an ARC grant in that category, and very well deserved too. So with that, I'm going to hand over now to Mark, who's going to say some introductory remarks before we pass through to hear from our main speaker, Virginia. So over to you, Mark. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Lorraine, for that introduction, and thanks to the Institute for Water Futures for hosting this event and doing pulling it together. And particularly, I want to note just how pleased I am to be sort of sharing the virtual stage with Virginia, because Virginia is a fantastic ambassador for Indigenous people, not only from Australia, but also from the region. And I think she requires a great deal of respect for her role in doing that. I was just asked to give a couple of sort of quick introductory comments in relation to the Glasgow COP, and Virginia was actually there, whereas I wasn't actually. A combination of COVID and various other things prevented me from being there. But I think ANU and Australia and the region were ably represented by Virginia and her colleagues, and I've heard a lot of really positive feedback about how they operated within Glasgow. Now, of course, for a lot of people, Glasgow is a bit of a receding memory. Like this was last year, and a lot of water has gone under the bridge, and there's a lot of noise in our system at the moment, which tends to focus on the immediate and to some extent the parochial rather than the long-term and important. And I think we need to think back to events like Glasgow to realign ourselves with those things which are crucial to the future of the world and to the peoples of the world and the environment of the world. And so I think it's a well-timed event. Thanks Lorraine for holding it. So just sort of recapping a few things that stand out for me in relation to Glasgow. Of course, there was the commitments by different countries and by many businesses to reduce emissions. But unfortunately, those commitments are not enough. Even if all countries actually did what they say they'd do under the Glasgow arrangements, we'd still be heading between 1.8 and 2.7 or maybe higher above pre-industrial temperatures. The evidence, however, for countries actually doing that is actually extremely thin. If we look at what has happened in terms of our greenhouse gas emissions over the last few years, there was a big dip in 2020 associated with COVID. So roughly speaking, about almost a 6% reduction. But last year that bounced back. So it didn't keep on trending down, which is what is necessary to actually meet the Paris Agreement goals, which are 1.5 degrees temperature rise, if possible, and certainly less than 2 degrees. And of course, in the meantime, we've got increasing evidence of climate impacts and their consequences, and they keep on accumulating. And just last week or week before, we gave the climate update, the ANU climate update, where we identified exactly what's going on across the globe and here in Australia. And in many respects, those impacts that are already occurring impact disproportionately on low-income and vulnerable populations, including Indigenous peoples around the world. There was some progress at Glasgow in terms of the loss and damage agenda. This is essentially looking to compensate in some way communities that are negatively affected by climate change and who don't have the resources to deal with it effectively themselves. And of course, again, loss and damage is particularly relevant for people in developing countries and Indigenous peoples. And in spite of the fact that there was recognition of loss and damage and some movement in a diplomatic sense, there was still not much actual movement either in terms of the policies or the funding associated with that. Another significant change in the Glasgow Conference of Parties was the global establishment of the global emissions trading system and the market infrastructure for that. And that has, in a sense, got intended social and environmental safeguards built in. How effectively they will occur and be implemented is a matter for the future. It's a matter for countries and for civil society to actually push for effective protection so we don't see this market infrastructure actually further enhancing and entrenching disadvantage, particularly in developing countries. But perhaps most relevant to this discussion today was the announcement of what's called the Glasgow Leaders Declaration on Forests and Land Use. Now, to date, Australia and 140 other nations have signed this, and cumulatively, according to the UN website, this covers about 91% of forests globally, which is a pretty amazing number that we've got such coverage associated with the signatories of this this agreement. If I sort of summarize the intentions of that agreement, it's to conserve forests and other ecosystems and to enhance sustainable agriculture at a global scale. It's to enhance lives and livelihoods of these people who use those different systems, and especially Indigenous people, and acknowledge the inherent rights of those peoples associated with that ecosystem use. It's to enhance policies, including trade, so as to increase positive impacts of trade on those people and ecosystems, and to decrease negative impacts, including through entrenching inequalities. And lastly, it's further commitments to increase financial flows to actually make these things happen. So whilst the Conference of Parties in many ways didn't tick all of the boxes, and I'm sure that Virginia will talk about this, is that I think it is a further step towards improving the status of peoples across the globe and the prospects for our environment in a time of climate change. So thanks very much, and I'll leave that here. And I think we move to Virginia.
Thanks, Mark.
Malingu, Ewan Nadi, Dr. Virginia Marshall, Roger Nyamba Yina. Thanks so much, everybody, for participating today. It's really important that we keep on talking about COP26, and the words that Mark Howden had provided us with are also alerting us to work still to be done. And that was an important message that I received myself once I had my appointment confirmed to go to the United Nations to represent the Pacific alongside another colleague from Fiji, Peter Quintero. And it was a very odd time because Mark has also been a very genuine advocate for Indigenous peoples and climate change, and to have his support to actually attend COP26 was very integral with me being able to go, because it was a terrible time where we had to seek exemptions from the Home Affairs, and also we had to prepare for having daily tests for COVID, and also whether we ourselves would have COVID at any particular time. So during the 3 weeks that I was there, it was a very edgy time. And also the United Nations had not requested that all people be vaccinated, which also created some concern with some people attending, and whether or not they would be there for the duration of the time for COP26 if they had contracted COVID. So there was a whole lot of paperwork, there were a whole lot of issues that we had to contend with. And I know that there were a number of colleagues that decided not to go because of the risk. And of course, we can understand institutional risk is one issue, but the minimisation of risk is the most important thing, which did happen. As a practicing lawyer, that's one issue that I'm used to dealing with. So COP26 was a first experience for me to attend, and I really take heed that we're not talking much about the Paris Agreement generally in civil society. And it seems to be many of these agreements and also the important areas of climate change are only starting now to be restated, such as renewables, emissions, especially before the election, and when the election will be called before May 21st this year with the federal government. So, we're exploring that as citizens of Australia's civil society, but also the one important area that we can't forget in Australia is that Indigenous peoples, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, are the first peoples who hold the first law, and also the knowledge systems for millennia. And that was one of the points that I remember raising continuously when I attended the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform, that we are the oldest surviving living culture in the world. And yes, we may be a numeric minority, however, we are the oldest civil peoples in the world. And there wasn't any contested argument by any other party, but there was a lot of support. And I think that's what we have to remember in Australia, is that Indigenous peoples are and should be the first and foremost peoples consulted and also consulted with, but that we also feature across all of our institutions, whether it be university or business or industry. And we know that we're not really on par with providing representation, or what we call a critical mass Indigenous peoples across those areas. But equally, that's what I saw as a different reality when I went to COP26, because sitting amongst local communities and Indigenous peoples, the reflection was that there are so many communities across the world that are living in countries where their indigeneity, their very right, their very identity is at risk every day, and it's life-threatening. So that and those issues that relate to personal risk and also a risk of death or being thwarted to protect your lands and waters was very real. And the other issue is traditional knowledge, that many countries still don't acknowledge that traditional knowledge is very important, not only to the state, the nation state, but seriously important to be controlled and for Indigenous peoples to have autonomy over that knowledge. And we suffer from those issues in Australia, especially intellectual property. And I can see by the number of agreements that I've looked through for communities over the years or their organisations that we're really not taking on board those responsibilities very well. However, there are some organisations that particularly are advanced and progressive in those issues. And the other example is the impact of climate change. That was much embodied in the People's Plenary on the last day when we heard the words of Alex Shand and the culmination of the agreement that was taking place and his final words on what was agreed. Now, the People's Plenary also included Indigenous peoples representatives on that particular occasion, but it also called for just transition. And this is another thing that another policy area that we're not really talking about enough, is how do we actually transition from fossil fuel and looking at a renewable future with any seriousness if we are not talking about just transition and the workforce and how that will affect people transitioning from fossil fuels, for example, to renewable jobs within the regions. And I'm from a rural area, and jobs are few and far between. They're probably available to young people only at particular supermarkets for various rosters, but any permanent and meaningful work is and doesn't seem to be available in rural and remote areas. So I think that was also a really important and powerful message. But the inclusion of people with disabilities was also incredible. In one chief area was that we had no representation previously for peoples with disability in any COP. So COP26 took a very important step to include people that need to be represented and have, like Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, the needs to be addressed and also climate change issues to be addressed for change and support in these areas of floods and drought and fires that we've been through for years. So that was also a very important issue for me to put thought to and consider. And the other area of the People's Plenary which was important was Indigenous peoples' voices and representation. Now, strangely enough, there wasn't any Indigenous Australians that were represented in the Indigenous Pavilion at COP26, and neither were there from the oldest continuing peoples representation on that final speech for the People's Plenary. It was some very incredible and spirited Native peoples from Canada who had a very powerful speech and representation to make. And hearing from the audience, it was accepted and applauded, and in rightful sense, it should have been applauded. But again, no representation from us. And walking through the Indigenous pavilion, we could see that it was only a small room, so our attendance was affected because we couldn't actually go into the room. It was a minimum amount of people allowed. There wasn't any seating, there wasn't any information apart from a small room. And it was also at the back of the pavilion. And again, when we did wander through the pavilion in totality with the nation states representing different issues of climate change and their various policies or legal or law reform positions, Australia had a representation of a mining truck carrying mining resources in the back of the truck. That was the message that we had. And that wasn't received by us or by others who understand what Indigenous Australians have actually been resisting and putting their voices loud and clear, that extractive industries are not the only industry or contributor to civil society, and certainly to GDP of this country. So, and there are other issues, of course, other than the GDP. It's the fabric and the heart of the country, the spirit of the country. And we don't put enough emphasis on those contributions from all peoples. So that was another issue that we found very confronting, and the NGOs that supported us were many. For example, the Australian Conservation Foundation provided a voice for myself and for a number of other people to really highlight the issues, and Better Futures Australia and Canna, for example. So there was very strong interest when I arrived and the days throughout that 3 weeks to find out what Indigenous people's views are in Australia and what we're experiencing. And I know from the many interviews that I gave, the webinars, and also when I came back from Australia, from COP26 to Australia, that the interest also continued. So what we're looking at here are some of the issues that we still will carry forward to COP27 in Egypt. But the most important thing that we need to understand in Australia is that there are others across the country of Indigenous peoples that are faring a lot worse, but we can't really understand or regulate Indigenous affairs by saying that we're a lucky country and in the same breath saying, well, we've got a lot to still do for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples, and really look at it in terms of wins and losses. And that was very clear when I attended not only providing interventions at various points of those local communities and Indigenous peoples platform meetings, but also throughout the whole year when I was a drafter and co-prepared the Universal Periodic Review with other NGOs and representatives from Indigenous Peoples Organisation, and also with NRIP. The intervention that I gave is one that was common, which was climate change and the issues that affect us with water and the commodification of water in Australia, and that Indigenous peoples in Australia are not faring well. And I think one of those issues I understand very clearly is because as a co-chair with Associate Professor Brad Mogridge from the University of Canberra, that we represent the Committee on Aboriginal Water Interests. And our main job is to ensure that the National Water Initiative is reformed. And that is what we were appointed to do by the Department of Agricultural, Water and Environment. And it's a big task. And these are a lot of the issues that were going through my head, and also those issues that I put forward in front of my fellow knowledge holders. And we shared that common experience that water is not to be commodified. And many times that when I've been asked to blind review these papers or policies on water, that the commodification of water in Australia is lauded by some as the best system available. However, we know historically and on the record that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people were not consulted as a whole. And there was a large reluctance by other stakeholders that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people be included with any water right or water interest or recognition at all in the National Water Initiative. So we need to understand that the job that we have to do with Cowie is important, but again, and like COP, we need to have partnerships and discussions, negotiations with a game changer. We have to have a new framework. We have to have a new discussion that just doesn't talk about adding on the Indigenous interests of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people of Australia, but how are we going to dismantle some of the areas that we're currently lauding as the most important issues across Australia. Now, we know in the past and recent times that we've had no drinking water across remote communities in Australia. And we also saw that with the Native peoples in Canada with those meetings in COP, that many of the communities in Canada, for example, have drinking water alerts with drinking water advisories. And there were over 150, which is incredible when you think that we have so much technology that's available. And we have the knowledge on the policy issues of water and law reform that communities in Canada are still suffering, as we are in Australia, not only with water and disease, but also from extractive industries. I heard the other day that there's large amounts of bauxite, for example, being dumped in a river. We know with the recorded history and documentation of uranium that that has also impacted the northern area of Australia greatly, and also where nuclear waste has been decidedly thought that the best place for it was in Aboriginal communities, not major cities. And I think that that's the sort of thing that we were discussing, and our similarities are incredible. We have those issues where autonomy is not a given, that we're still fighting for self-determination, not only across institutions, but industry, the governments, the parliament, and also on these issues such as really reforming water policy and water law. And the most important thing is that we have to engage as Indigenous peoples in that process with COP. And that's one thing that I saw with the Scottish people, that they felt that they weren't included in the conversation for climate change or included in the COP26 process. Yes, there were events that were held for the public. However, they were sold out well before they were mature in their advertising. So that was also another issue that people felt a lack of inclusion, but we also felt a lack of inclusion as well, not only for the example that I gave with the Indigenous Pavilion, but also that we weren't able to go to all the events and the plenaries that were held across COP26. I think the most important part of the process in getting that communication through to Australia and across the world was also being interviewed and having that opportunity to talk with colleagues. And as Mark has pointed out, loss and damage clearly has had some progress. However, there is much to do on that area. And namely because we know with rising sea levels in the Torres Strait Islander area, and also the impact internally in Australia with heating events and floods, and also, the changes that have been made over 100 years or so to rivers, and the impact of dying fish. We've seen reports on those over the years, and it was loud and clear that the way that we operate within water systems has to change. But again, those issues have been quiet for some time. So I think with climate change and coming up to an election, it's really important that we revive these conversations. And And that is clearly what I can hear from my experiences with the Indigenous peoples and local communities discussions, that we see that a lot of species, for example, in Canada, moose being very few in number, the caribou also very few in number, and the impacts of on permafrost and glaciers in those regions are significant. And it's also requiring Indigenous peoples to adapt when they're not given the resources to adapt to these changing environments. And because they're in extreme areas across the world, and as we know in Australia, they're extremely remote areas, that the support services and the cooperation and coordination with Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander peoples are not effective. And this is one thing that we need to actually look at. And we need to ask questions during this time of a changing government across Australia and across the world in our questioning of Aboriginal people's autonomy and self-determination, and if that's happening within our own country. So I think those issues were important, and traditional knowledge, of course, and Lorraine's kindly mentioned the new project that I have with the Australian Research Council, and that's looking to some of those issues that are affected by climate change, which are Aboriginal medicines, and also the ongoing knowledge holding by Indigenous peoples in Australia of that knowledge, and the continued access to medicines, which will also be cures not only for Australians in general, as well as the people who are holders of that creation story and the lore and the story of those areas. But also we need to understand that there are also world benefits, they're international priorities. And we talked about bush tucker, Aboriginal bush foods and traditional bush foods for a number of years. But the threat of climate change on Aboriginal medicines is quite severe. And we've seen that in the Amazon and the clearing of the lands and the access and use of those knowledges and the free, prior, informed consent issues. We seem to have tossed out the precautionary principles often, not only with water, but with other issues across the environment. And I think that one thing that we have to remember, which again, jointly we held together in these meetings that I had in the UN, was that we have a commonality and a connectivity. We might use different language, but that connectivity with Indigenous peoples is so inherently important. And we shared that and those stories of that relationship where we saw if the trees or the water was affected by pollution or climate change or other events, that we felt that as people. It affected us. It affected not only the way we spiritually exist, but it affects us in our obligations that we are responsible to carry out. But very often we're not in control of the process or the drive for development across Australia. We can see that housing developments don't give much support to social housing and public housing, but they also don't give heed to the connectivity of Aboriginal peoples to those environment. And as I know with site surveys that I've experienced and undertaken years ago, that we're forced to actually say what is an important site. So what is significant to us in this area, and to identify that as a low, medium and high matrix. So that doesn't work for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people to be boxed in and compartmentalised in our environment. And we can see across campus, and any campus actually across Australia, that there are so many weeds and really a toxic environment on our creeks and the rivers that flow through different campuses. And we need to see that in our own backyard. We need to understand that COP26 is everybody's business. So that means living locally and understanding that we need to work with Aboriginal people. And for example, Aboriginal land care is also an important feature of the Australian landscape, that we need to keep those areas healthy, but we need to partner and work with and be led by Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. And that was another clear message that we also received while at COP, that we need to be in control of those environments. And many times we talk about co-management as an example in Australia, but we can see with some of these co-management concepts and frameworks that they plainly don't work because there are far many to a large amount of restrictions and conditions based on Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people on what they access, whether it's water, and we find that's a big issue in Australia, water management, water quality, water literacy is a huge issue with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, and understanding it in plain language, how we actually, as an Australian society, value Indigenous values in water or the environment per se. And also Mark's pointed out a very important area, which is forests. Do we continue to fell hard growth forests? Are we not concerned that that is also not only going to affect Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, but it's also going to affect our relationship to our totems, to our kinship, with the sky, with the earth below. Everything that we see and understand is part of our good health. It's not just apportioned by the access to water quality and an understanding of that through Western science. So I think that a lot of those messages I tried to get through when I was presenting, and especially Earth Observation Day was one significant area, and also an invitation to present at the Resilience Hub. That was also a key message about Aboriginal medicines and the importance of protecting traditional knowledge, and that Aboriginal people need to be in control of that process. And also for Earth Observation Day was a similar message at the UN, and also to really let people know that there are so many good examples of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities under Indigenous protected areas, and many other examples, Indigenous ranges, for example, across Australia, whether it's sea ranges or land ranges or both, that funding needs to be seriously invested in, and the funds go to young people. And that again was another message, that young people need to be prioritised alongside elders, and with elders providing that support and guidance. So I think that, having that next step where we understand it, even in institutions, that we need to encourage knowledge and wisdom, but also that knowledge and wisdom and the transference of that knowledge doesn't happen only by a Western education. It must be that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people are represented by elders and what we might see as statesmen or judges in the community, but they need to be an integral fabric of how we see our institutions and how we plan and run and conceptualise our industries, and also business is extremely important. So the messages that I took back was that we really need to prepare ourselves for inclusion. And inclusion means, and one of the issues that Mark was finding a bit difficult in the last few days was the IPCC reports and the meetings that he held into those early hours of the morning. And the response by Indigenous peoples at COP was that we need to see that it's not only hard copy written reports of Western science or education that need to be only prioritised, that Indigenous people's voices and authorship needed to be included in the IPCC reporting, and it needed to appear alongside other authors, because that lack of inclusion the members saw as deeply frustrating but also hurtful, because that also says to many people across the world that unless it's written down, it's not going to be awarded the same weight and importance. So that oral history, the oral knowledge systems, which Western law in itself started from an oral history. So we have to provide that space to include Indigenous peoples. And that was a very loud and very clear message that was brought home. So I think that all in all, the messages are climate change is real, as Mark said. The science is clear. We've got incredible science researchers at ANU and across the Australian landscape. We have incredible Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander scholars that need to be utilised much more, and a space created, especially not only in water, but across the landscape of environmental policy. So I think that my time in retrospect with COP26 was very valuable. And I heard that a number of responses were that it was a failure, but it's not a failure, it's an opportunity that we can do better next time, and also acknowledge that we have done well in some of these areas. And it's important that we have Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people funded to go to COP26, 27 and further, because we need to have that representation. It's not good enough just to have a belief that it's going to be a conference of parties, and really it's only the people who are funded to attend, which are a very few in number by the United Nations, and a very modest support, but we appreciate that support. So we need to make sure that people can donate, that young people and elders and knowledge holders and other members of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community can attend and be vocal and can experience COP and understand those processes. And I think that that was an important part of what we must do better with COP27, is going to have that inclusive policy. But again, you know, it is all about everybody's business. So that looking into your own backyard, to where you live, to the issues that still remain, unkept sides of the roads being overrun by exotic species. The threatened species list is increasing to endangered. Also water quality for people living across Australia that seriously cannot get access to drinking water or available water. And there are many Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that still do not have that access. And also there's ownership and entitlements and allocation of water, of issues that that the Committee on Aboriginal Water Interests have to discuss, to negotiate. So that process is still ongoing, and a very important process to be done. So I think all in all, what I would sum this whole understanding up about my experience and the experience of others at those meetings, and our attendance and coming back and trying to make sense of it all, is that we have to remain passionate. We have to, if we haven't already, be engaged with Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander communities where we live, where we work, and also keep our minds open for change, where institutional change should be made, where that critical mass of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people need to be adopted, and also that we remain steady that climate change is not something we're willing to live with. We also want to have solutions for, and solutions that exist that can also not only improve the lifestyle of our very existence, but also improve the life of our flora and fauna, and the very main issue that we need, which is water. And we have to hold on to that. Even though food security is important, this country, which is a very arid and the most ancient of countries, needs water, and we need to value that. So my message is thank you so much for coming today and attending, and we really know that your support is important, and don't lose hope, because we know that we can overcome these issues. that still remain in progress. So thank you. Manangu.
Thank you very much, Virginia, for those really rich set of observations and views that you just presented there. I mean, for me, one of the key messages was, COP26 is everyone's business, and so I think not just us as researchers, but us as community members and family members and friends and colleagues, and so I thought that was a really powerful message that the opportunity is essentially in our hands, and it's up to us to really convert that and make progress here. I guess one of the other messages for me is the importance of having a strong ANU delegation for the next conference of parties, the one in Egypt, COP27, and so we actually do have the ability at ANU to apply for badges for accreditation for people to go to COP. So if you're interested, get in touch with me and we can apply. It's not guaranteed that we get those, but we can apply for those. And so as I said, I think ANU has a lot to offer COP, and I think it's a great learning experience and a great networking experience, as well as being able to have some impact. And so I think really encourage that. So I just want to move in the remaining sort of about 10 minutes to some of the questions, and so we've got just a few sitting in the Q&A, and you just reminding people. Put your questions in and vote for the ones that you like, so that they come to the top of the list. So at the moment, we've got just a few there. So probably the first one I'll ask just is, as a non-Indigenous person working with First Nations in water management, do you have any thoughts or advice for including or giving equal weight to oral input to decisions in a culturally appropriate way? So, different mechanisms